And move to item number 6. Commission Policy 26, Management Analyst 3, Kim Jolly, for possible action. Currently, there are 2 existing commission policies that are numbered 26. One is entitled Transparency from 2011, and the other is entitled Reestablishing, Introducing, Transplanting, and Managing Pioneering Rocky Mountain Elk from 1995. The department is recommending that the Reestablishing, Introducing, Transplanting, and Managing Pioneering Rocky Mountain Elk from 1995 be reaffirmed as Policy 26, and that Transparency be renumbered as Commission Policy 26A. The Commission may also take action to review the revised Commission Policy Index and numbering system. Ms. Jolly.
Kim Jolly for the record. I believe couldn't have said it better. It's a pretty straightforward item. We have included in the support material the explanation and purpose and organization of the commission policies, a revised index, and copies of both of these policies. We're simply trying to renumber one of them to read 26A, and that's for DAG's advice. So if you have any questions, I'm available.
I don't know if it's so much a question as a statement, but I think I saw one of the county advisory boards suggest that maybe we should pick a different number for policy 26A. And what I would say to that is we have an active committee that's reviewing all of the policies, and I think before we know what the recommendation is on the future disposition of what we're proposing as policy 26A, that it doesn't make sense to use up an unused number. So I think it's, like you said, and Kim mentioned it, it's pretty straightforward. What we had is 2 policy 26, and it got brought up because policy 26 on the website was on transparency, and there wasn't one posted for elk. So we're trying to clarify that there actually are 2 overlaid policy 26s. Any questions or discussion by the commission? Commissioner Hubbs?
Yeah, it's just very basic, but so I guess the rationale is that if there is an error and we do find that there's duplicate policy numbers, then the tentative rule right now would be that we list the later policy, the most earliest developed policy as the A, and so forth moving forward. I mean, we keep the original number for the oldest policy.
Right, that would make the most sense.
That seems what the rule is. I was just trying to get clarification on that. Okay.
Yeah, and I think this duplication situation is probably going to be an exception rather than the rule, so I don't anticipate keeping this too many more times. Additional questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, this is an action item, so County Advisory Board input on item number 6, Commission Policy 26, renumbering. Public comment in Reno. Come on up.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Bob Schweigert. I own and operate an Intermountain Range Consultants, which is a natural resources management consulting business. I work for RDD Inc., or VACA Inc., Happy Creek Inc., and DeLong Ranches Inc. These ranches brought comment and questions as to Policy 26, and it's whether it still existed or not. And we haven't seen the supporting material for this reaffirmation that's subject of action today, and we would simply like to be able to reserve the opportunity to comment on and have review of it pending receipt of that supporting material.
Okay, additional comments in Reno? Public comment in Elko?
No comment in Elko.
Okay, comment in Las Vegas?
No public comments in Las Vegas.
Okay, thank you. Questions by the commission or further discussion? Okay, if there's not, I would entertain a motion. Commissioner McNair?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make a motion to reaffirm Policy 26, titled Reestablishing, Introducing, Transplanting, and Managing Pioneering Rocky Mountain Elk as presented. And just as a little side note, I think with all due respect to our gentleman that came up and talked, I think we're just simply reestablishing something that we believe has already been there. and just making sure that we put it on the record and recognizing the other sister, if you want, the other policy that was labeled as 26 as 26A. That'll be part of my motion. I'll go back. But I think that there'll be opportunity to address it if we needed to in the future. If there's need to revise that, that's all stuff that can happen in the future. I think it's important that we recognize it, reaffirm it. So I'll reiterate my motion is to reaffirm policy 26, reestablishing, introducing, transplanting, and managing pioneering Rocky Mountain elk as policy 26, and recognizing the policy title transparency as 26A.
Okay, do I have a second? Second. Okay, so I have a motion from Commissioner McNinch and a second by Commissioner Wallace to reaffirm the policy regarding elk as as policy number 26, and the policy on transparency as policy 26A. Is there any question or discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed? Motion carries 9-0. We'll close item number 6 and move to item number 7. This is the Humboldt County Elk Subplan, second reading. Committee Chairman Eddie Booth and Western Region Biologist 3 Ed Partee. This is for possible action. The Commission will be presented with the draft Humboldt County Elk Subplan for review and possible action. The draft Humboldt County Elk Subplan has incorporated edits from discussion of the Nevada Board of Wildlife Commissioners, Humboldt County Commission, and at a sub-planning meeting held on April 12, 2016. This draft is provided for final review and possible adoption. So just a couple of items. We do have, per the agendized item, we do have the ability to approve this plan today if the Commission is comfortable doing so. We also have the ability to table this for another reading if needed. At the March meeting, Mr. Schweigert provided a bunch of information that there were some complications with in terms of email delivery because of the size of the files. So what we asked the department to do is put all of the files onto a thumb drive and send those out to the commissioners with an index. I received mine. It appeared to have 6 documents and 24 attachments, including a 1A and a 1B, if I remember correctly. I've had a chance to review all that information, but I just wanted to confirm that the rest of the commissioners had received the thumb drive and all the information that was contained.
I did.
Okay. Anyone not receiving that? I know Commissioner Mora, you had a concern that maybe one of the alternative plans that had been proposed somehow missed your thumb drive, and I think that was provided to you in the last several days.
Exactly.
Okay. Right, so that's where we stand. So if Mr. Booth and Mr. Partee could come up, get this item started.
Good morning. For the record, Ed Partee, Nevada Department of Wildlife. Eddie Booth, Chairman of the Humboldt County Elk Management Plan. All right, since the March 23rd meeting, our committee met again on April 12th and addressed the concerns or the comments from this commission. And we clarified that in the plan. It was a quick turnaround, and I believe at the March 23rd commission meeting during open public meeting, well, I think one of our people on the board, with Tom Casanelli, told this committee that we were going to be having another meeting on April 12th, just so that you guys were aware of it, just because of the quick turnaround time. We wanted to have a quick turnaround time because we were tasked with bringing this in front of the Humboldt County Commissioners, which that meeting took place on April 18th with the edits that we had from the comments from this commission. From there, we went to the county commissioners, presented the information, this plan, and I concurred with one of the commissioners, county commissioners this morning, that they had received the same documentation that you all received from Mr. Schwager. They had that prior to our meeting with the county commissioners, and at that county commission meeting they approved this plan and liked how it came out, being a local plan like Mr. Morai suggested, and they unanimously passed that plan. So if there's any questions on it or anything Eddie would like to add.
Mr. Booth, why don't you go ahead, and then if we have questions, we'll ask them of both of you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, the presentation this morning about employee appreciation, I want to thank all the commissioners for what they do as public service for the state of Nevada. It's always nice to be recognized. I know sometimes that you are not. This committee was made up of 15 members of the Humboldt County citizens. We held meetings approximately once a month, but another NDOW employee who was there and took minutes for us many times here today, and her name is Katie Harmon. I'd like to thank her for her tireless efforts during her pregnancy and always managing to complete the minutes on time. Also, Mr. Partee, famous for his picture the other day on the front page of the paper, Nevada Gazette Journal. He worked tirelessly in preparing the preliminary report and making all the changes that we had during each of our meetings. First of all, I think that in Ed's presentation, in having this resubmitted to the committee, I appreciate the board's appreciation for what our local committee has done and submitting it back to the committee rather than making a decision and letting the 15 members of our committee, the county commissioners, indicate that what we have been working on and successfully agreeing to was not changed by the state commission. And I think it was obvious with the committee members in determining that what we had initially had planned, the few changes that were recommended were made. Also, the same decision by the county commissioners. And in spite of the objections of Mr. Schweigert, I want the commission to know that 2 days prior to our meeting, he sent out 4,000 additional pages for us to have at our meeting, which I think is a disservice to those 15 members who have jobs outside serving on the committee to not only look at the 2,100 pages that were brought to the commission initially, but an additional 4,000 pages 2 days before is not a fair presentation on behalf of the committee, or in all due respect to Mr. Schweigert, I think it allows us to find out that it created more of a controversy with sportsmen. And rather than the compromise that we have now in our numbers, sportsmen on the committee have now countered and said that if this continues, they are willing to move above and beyond the compromise that we have. And I think that's not what we allowed. That's not what we agreed to. Our agreement was to follow the goals of the committee, which was to minimize conflict, and we've done that. Then when we got to our meeting, Mr. Schweigert blamed me for not personally calling him and telling him that we have a meeting. This was publicized in our normal way with the open meeting law, and having him come to the meeting and criticizing me, texting me and telling me that it was a dissatisfaction to him that I did not personally call him and provide him all the opportunities that I've provided everybody else in our county, in our state, with the open meeting law, did it the same way as we have always done so. And in ending, we agreed to have a COT committee. In that COT committee, we have had a request to have a guide on that committee that will be addressed with our first COT team, I hope. The second thing is I spoke to Mr. DeLong, who Mr. Schweigert represents. And in all due respect to all the ranchers and all the sportsmen in Humboldt County, I think we've come up to a nice compromise. I hope that Mr. DeLong is, I think his concern is the trust factor that they've given us as the 15 members of the committee. We've come up with a elk management plan that I think will serve our county very well. And I want to let the commissioners, the Nevada Department of Wildlife commissioners, know that for us to be on this committee and represent not only you, but our county, it's important that we follow this plan and that you do everything possible so that we can hold our head up high, knowing that we represented you and our counties. Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, I have one more thing to add, if that's possible. Also, what was sent with the plan was the people that we recommend for the COP team. We would ask approval of that as well. The only one that was hanging out there prior to the Humboldt County Commission meeting was Mr. Ron Cherry, which he had to be appointed by the County Commission, and in doing so, they did on their April 18th meeting. So we'd also ask that you look at this list and possibly go forward with that list as well.
A couple questions for you both. The first, I think I'll direct to Committee Chairman Booth. I think the crux of the matter and the correspondence that Mr. Schweikert has provided, really the two things that this commission, I think, is most interested in is the two alternatives that he's presented to us. Were those two alternatives presented to your committee, and did you guys have a discussion on what was being suggested within those two alternatives? And are you confident that the committee clearly understood that by adopting this plan that they essentially were rejecting those two proposed alternatives?
There was no committee member that made a motion to accept those. It was brought up by Commissioner Morai in public comment to address those, and he explained those alternatives. The response, I believe, in recollection of the comments made at our meeting, was that we have this committee, we have this plan. And in addition, so in my opinion, it's a working, living copy of what the future of Humboldt County Health Management will be. And because of the nature of the beast, 6,000 documents to be read and try to understand and to appease the desires of Mr. Schweigert, it was a process that I think that was not going to be completed that day or tomorrow or next year. And I think what we plan to do in our comments at the committee was address that at the next or the first COT committee consisting of 10 members of the county.
But in terms of, I think one alternative proposes basically removing all of the Area 3 units from the plan, and the other suggests maybe making no tolerance areas or zero elk populations in those Area 3 units. The committee understood that. That's what the request was.
Understood it and addressed it in previous meetings. In fact, we went on a recollection of recall of previous meetings where those were addressed, and there was no desire by any of the committee members, nor myself, to change anything that we have in the plan.
Okay. And then, Mr. Partee, could you go over, I think the commission had directed two clarifications, one being the frequency with which the plan was reviewed and updated, and the other being what occurs when the population objective reaches 75%.
Correct,
So
yes.
Could you talk to me just a little bit about the updates that were?
I believe it was on page 10 of the plan where we had the previous version of this plan was highlighted in red, asking this commission, within 5 years to, reopen the plan if need be. Since the last commission meeting, after suggestions that were brought up from this commission, we had changed that and put that purview under the guidance of the COT. The COT would then take any issues throughout the year. They'll be meeting at least once a year to deal with any issues, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, dealing with those issues, and if things are substantial enough that can't be taken care of on the local level, then it would be brought to this commission to revise that plan. So that was that part of it. The other part was that trigger that we talked about. I think that was on page 7, and I think Commissioner Hubbs brought that up. And it was the ability to effectively manage the herds once they reach that 75% of that population number that we had. And from there, what that indicates is that we'd be doing aggressive management to make sure that population didn't go blowing past that top number.
Okay, and along those lines, I think I understand where the committee was going and the intent of that. I think Commissioner Morai, who made many of those meetings understands that. And I guess my question was, I would be a lot more comfortable if there was mention of that made under the management actions. In particular, on page 25, item number 3, it talks about health populations will be maintained within the population objectives defined within this subplan. And I guess my suggestion would be to add a second sentence there that says when a population reaches 75% of the population objective, the department shall work with the commission to implement harvest strategies that limit or stop population growth before the population objective is reached or exceeded. And I think that meets the intent of the discussions at the subcommittee meeting, and what it does for me and this body going forward is it makes it very clear what the actions and course of action should be once those thresholds are met. Does that make sense, and does that meet the intent of Chairman Booth and Ed, what the committee had discussed?
I agree. I think it also, I think it empowers the plan and the Department of Wildlife to give the appearance of trust and understanding for all those individuals in the county that see this plan and wonder what's going to happen. What you just stated, I think, confirms that.
All right, that's all the questions I had at this time, but are there additional commission comments or questions? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think that, in my mind, that's your latest suggestion, because if I remember correctly, I asked that question at the last meeting about the triggers, because I had a little trouble finding where that trigger was in the plan. And so if this has it kind of in two different places, it's a little clearer.
Okay. Anything else, Mr. Morai, having made every meeting, all but one meeting?
All but one, I think.
You made a lot of meetings. None additional commission question or comment? Commissioner Hubbs?
Yeah, trying to get up to speed with this, I was able to look through some of Mr. Swagger's information, and I guess for me, I was looking at this, trying to assess some of the issues that were coming up. More importantly, with the ranchers, it appears that they have the permits to graze their cattle out in federal land, and that there's fear, it appears that if these numbers were to increase, perhaps there's going to be overlap of habitat use and lack of resources to support the current permits at issue and the elk that may eventually come into the areas. And I did take a look at some of our regulatory framework to see what could happen. And I don't know, these permit holders, are they landowners? Because our regulatory structure speaks to landowners only if there's disputes or issues. And I don't see how they would voice their concerns through through the framework that we have right now if they're not actually out there living on the land. You know, they just have the permits in hand.
Right, and I think that's a discussion that came up a lot within the committee. It's obviously a bit confusing in that the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service administer the grazing permits, and the state has authority over wildlife. And so questions were asked in terms of whether or not the BLM had authority to allow elk to establish in those areas. Questions were raised as to whether or not the BLM needed and the Forest Service needed to update their resource management plans and Forest Service management plans respectively. And all the input I heard from the Forest Service and the BLM folks that were there is their belief was that they would not have to update either of those plans, and they were active and willing participants within the discussions. I'm sure we're going to hear some more information on that in public comment, but it is definitely an interesting dynamic given the way the structure works between regulation of grazing and who's responsible for that, and regulation of wildlife and who's responsible for that. So.
Right, and I also was thinking about that point not having been brought to the table the first time we saw the plan. You know, we got the information after our last commission meeting, so catching up with that, I did take a moment just to see with my concerns with carrying capacity again. Are they taking into consideration in their modeling for numbers that there's already permits issued? And I didn't really see that. I do see mention of habitat use near watering holes taking into account perhaps cattle grazing in that area, but really nothing else. So I didn't know if there was another variable that was being assessed in terms of use and carrying capacity for the permits issued to date.
Yeah, in that whole document, we took out all private land. Anything that was private land, that came right off the top. Half-mile buffer within water came out as well. And then after we've taken out those parameters, then it went in front of the technical review team who then assessed it from there as well. And those numbers got cut even further from what the habitat assessment, just because of the fact that we wanted to start kind of at a minimal level with elk. And then, so that was the recommendation to the subcommittee. The subcommittee then took it and did the other end with the cattle grazing, the AUMs allotted, for these, and then cut those numbers additionally from there. So there's more elk that have been removed from the county than, what it can hold, obviously. And the other thing that was brought up several times in that meeting is there's a lot of other areas in the state that have a lot more elk present currently than what Humboldt County has or has plans to have. And nowhere else in the state has there been a loss of AUMs, grazing allotments, for permittees that have been documented. So that was all reviewed from the committee.
And I would just say in the meetings that I observed, a lot of the discussions, once the technical review committee came back with the recommendations to the sub-planning committee, and I think the beauty of the sub-planning group and the value of the sub-planning group is that you had a variety of interests, and a lot of the discussions that were had geared around how do we make sure that we learn from past experience in terms of allowing this elk herd to grow slowly. And part of the reason you saw the 75% trigger and the clarification I had in here, how do we do that in a manner that we reduce potential for conflicts on multiple use public lands, and then the establishment of the COT committee. So going forward, if issues are starting to pop up, that local team and committee basically advise us as to, hey, we're starting to see a problem even with these small numbers. We may need to adjust numbers. We may need to adjust harvest strategies. We may need to implement some of the variety of tools that we have available to minimize impacts to private lands or permits. So there were a lot of discussions, I think, at the committee meetings that centered around that potential for multiple use conflict.
I'm taking that into, I was looking at the COT members, and do we have the member that is representing some of the ranchers or permittee holders?
We do, and in fact, I think there is both a BLM permitted rancher and a Forest Service permitted rancher recommended for the COT.
Who are those individuals, Jeremy?
Hank Duffarina is the recommended BLM rancher, and Tom Casanelli is the Forest Service permittee. And both of those gentlemen served on the steering sub-planning group.
So both of those gentlemen actually have a grazing permit?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Additional questions or comments?
The other nice thing about having members on that COT is we also have Mr. Ron Cherry, who also has a permit both on BLM and on forest, and he is a county commissioner. So, excuse me, that's why he was also assigned to that, so that we have it covered in multiple fashions there.
Commissioner Johnston?
I guess this is a question. I just want to make sure I understand, and I will use 051 as an example. The committee identified all the available elk habitat and put that into 3 categories of low, moderate, or high based upon the quality of the habitat. That would be all public land habitat, and then we see the numbers, and you then calculated what that habitat could support in terms of elk per square mile.
Correct.
And that way you get this number of, for example, in 051 of 771 to 1651 is the number of elk that unit could sustain. But then you started reducing the numbers by doing the half-mile buffers from water, other factors, and then there was ultimately the advisory committee action that takes it to the ultimate number. Those numbers, in this example, you have habitat for 771 to 1651 elk, but the advisory committee action is 100 to 200 elk. I want to make sure I understand what we're trying to do is to avoid conflict between water right holders, grazing permit holders, and that thing. This number of elk in that unit would not impact those individuals. Is that a fair summary?
That is exactly how it took place.
Okay. Thank you.
Additional questions or comments? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One thing I might add on that COT team, also, because I've been an advocate of trying to keep this process local in Humboldt County, is that the committee selected these members for the original COT team. Then, as these members need to be replaced, it goes to the Humboldt County Commission, correct? So that assures that as new members are added onto this team, it's still going to be locally controlled as to who is on the COT team.
Any other questions or comments?
I guess I have
Commissioner
a
Hudson.
question. I'm sorry, Jeremy. So I'm just trying to understand, and you've said in the past that we've used the COT teams before successfully because, like I said, through our regulatory framework, the permittees don't have a lot of clout if they're not, if they don't have a voice on the COT team, and the COT team is going to inform the commissioners as to what their recommendations might be for certain, I'm just wondering if there's anything that we think we may need to do for permittee holders for relief with the elk, or do you think, just because there's really, if there is a dispute, then it sounds like the COT team's the only option for the permittee holders to...
I guess I would disagree with that. I think the COT team is one option. There's also a county wildlife advisory board that those concerns could be expressed to. Obviously, a permittee who has a concern could come directly to this body and express that concern. So I think there's multiple avenues where those concerns could be expressed.
Well, the other thing with that also is Department of Wildlife has a whole list of things we can do before it even gets to that position with private land. We have towards the back of that plan, there's the appendix of all the different tools, if you will, that the Department of Wildlife can utilize to minimize conflict on those private acres. What the COT team is going to look at is also not only private, but the permits as well. So that's why we for sure wanted a Forest Service representative in there and a BLM representative in there to kind of address those issues if habitat issues become an issue. And to get back to Mr. Morai's comment on the COT team, yes, it is correct that the Humboldt County Commissioner would appoint locally, but that still has to come to this board for final approval, just to make that clear. So they will have their recommendation. We will bring it forward to this board and say, do you support this recommendation? So ultimately, this commission has the final say as well.
Any additional questions or comments? Commissioner Hubbs, did we answer your questions?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen. Stick around or stay close because we may have some follow-ups. With that, this is an action item, so I'll open it up first to county advisory boards for input on item number 7, Humboldt County Elk Subplan, second reading. Mr. Casanelli.
For the record, Tom Casanelli of Humboldt County. We were totally in support of the plan, and I also would like to thank Ed and Eddie for what they've accomplished up there. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional county advisory boards.
Sean Shea, Washington County. We approved this unanimously. I'd like to say I applaud these guys for putting all the effort into this. Pete for going to those. It's grueling, and I appreciate you guys doing all that.
Mr. Dixon.
Paul Dixon, Clark County Chairman. We also approved this unanimously, but the other thing I would point out is that this plan versus the ones that I've seen on the 9 years that I've been on the advisory board is the most complete, complex, and other things. And my question back to this commission is, are we going to be updating the other elk plans to be consistent with the level of detail in this one? Because it's pretty amazing and really lays out how you manage elk in the state better than anything I've ever seen. Thank you.
Additional county advisory board input? Okay, seeing none, public comment in Reno. And I know there's at least 2 individuals that are representing the 4 ranches, so Mr. Schweiger, why don't you come on up and give us your name and who you're representing, and I think there's at least 1 other formal representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, my name is Bob Schweiger. I own and operate Intermountain Range Consultants. I represent the ranches, which I identified earlier. That's RDD Inc., or Vaca Inc., Happy Creek Inc., and DeLong Ranches Inc. Just by way of introduction, I hold a bachelor's degree in range management, specializing in wildlife habitat management. I also hold a master's degree in forest and range management, specializing in wildlife habitat management. My thesis dealt with estimating forage yield and protein content in summer elk diets and how it affected elk movements. And I bring this to the Commission's attention just so you know we're not babes in the woods. We have some kind of knowledge of both elk-specific management as well as wildlife habitat management, as well as range management. The conflict I see here that has developed, I think, can be summarized in what I heard from several of the steering committee members in the April 12th meeting. And that was that they have done exactly what this Wildlife Commission has asked them to do. And I think that's true. I think they have, and I think they've done it to the best of their ability. And I think the conflict has arisen from this commission in asking the steering committee to formulate a plan for all of Humboldt County, when not all of Humboldt County has elk occupying it. And so the alternative 1 that we have presented to you accounts for elk where elk exist in Humboldt County. In other words, Area 051. They don't exist in 03s, and this alternative is in complete compliance and direct compliance with Policy 26, which the Commission has just a few minutes ago reconfirmed. We believe that the Humboldt County April 12th plan is not in compliance with it. And we believe, therefore, that our alternative 1 should be the chosen alternative here. The alternative 2 that we presented presumes that the planning for elk outside of where they presently exist under Policy 26 can proceed. And all we have done in that case is to simply ask for the edits to the plan to have a no established population in the ranch's particular areas of use and permitted use and private lands. Commissioner Hubbs asked the question whether the permittees actually own lands in these areas. That's been identified in all the packets that we've given you. These people own tens of thousands of acres. They are also permitted on hundreds of thousands of BLM acreage. So I hope that answers that question. And Mr. Chairman, I would ask for your indulgence and give me a little more than 6 minutes on this discussion due to the questions and answers that you got from Mr. Partee and Mr. Booth.
We're at about 3:30 now, so you've got a little bit of time, and if there's questions, we'll get to that.
Okay. There's been a lot of discussion about the triggers and 75% resulting in some aggressive actions by the NDOW. And I'll refer you to the April 12th plan that reports two counts on Santa Rosa Range for the existing population there. The first count, they were able to find 21 bulls, period. The second count, they were able to find nothing, even including the collared animals. So that gives us great pause as to any assurances that A, the number of animals can be tallied, and B, they can be effectively controlled. The second thing that gives us great pause is that these aggressive management tools were used in the garbage population, and the garbage population continued to rise at an annual rate of 8%. When they were released from the aggressive hunts, they increased at a rate of 15%. Now, at 8% or 15%, it doesn't take anybody long to figure out on a compounded interest that pretty soon you double your numbers. And we have great pause that A, these numbers should be established at all, given the harm that these animals can create, and B, that they can be effectively controlled at the numbers that are prescribed. The question was asked about carrying capacity and by Commissioner Hubbs, and your observation of no accounting for the present allocated AUMs is dead on. There isn't anyone on this plan, in this plan. This plan adopts a means of develop a carrying capacity based on 1 to 5 animals per square mile. And I'm pretty familiar with the BLM and the Forest Service manuals, and I'm going to tell you that methodology isn't in there. The second thing is that the provision for a half-mile buffer around waters is meaningless. It's meaningless because elk use within that half mile and cattle use outside that half mile. And so no accounting has been made from A, the total forage capacity, subtracting the livestock forage that's already been allocated, and subtracting the suspended non-use to get to a possible elk number. And Mr. Partian saying that occurred is incorrect. It simply did not occur.
Okay, Mr. Schweiger.
Or at least there's no record of it in this April 12th.
You're at your time. I'm going to give you an opportunity to answer just a couple of the questions with a couple final bullet points.
Okay. Those are my main points, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any, Commissioner Hubbs, did you have a follow-up question, or?
No, he did let me know that they are actually landowners, so there's that type of concern as well as, obviously the resource overlap on federal lands that can be an issue. I was honing in more on the federal overlap because I did not see that addressed. It was explained to me in a little bit more detail that there was a technical review team that spent some time on that. I'm almost wondering why it's not in the plan. That methodology, I think, or it might be, and I don't remember. I did read through the plan quite a while back, but I read through more of the information that came through on the disc this time. But it might be beneficial to have that in there so we can understand the decision making, recorded in some capacity.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Schweiger. And I believe there's at least one other formal representative of the ranches here. Are there individuals from the ranches here today, just so we know? Are you aware?
I think so.
Okay. Thank you. Please state your name and who you represent.
For the record, my name is Paul Taggart. I represent Happy Creek Ranch and Fort Baca, Inc. I am an attorney, so no offense, I hope is garnered by that. And I just want to say quickly, Endow was my first client nearly 20 years ago now. And so it's nice to be back. We were defending against the Elko grand jury back in those days out in Elko County, and that was really interesting. My comments focus on water rights and the potential impact on water rights from the elk plan, and my suggestion is going to be if you do entertain the plan that's been presented to you, as opposed to the alternatives. I have a few suggestions on ways to add concerns for water rights to the plan, and so that's going to be the focus of my comments. The plan indicates that it was intended to address impacts to adjacent private land resources. So right out of the box, it doesn't seem to intend to really address water resources, and we think it's real important that be included, and that there be included in the plan a way to address potential impacts to water resources if that were to occur. There is a state statute, and I'll just go into a little bit of background here. There is a state statute that says that water rights that are granted by the state engineer are granted subject to providing access to wildlife for that customarily used a water resource. But the water resources that I'm concerned about here are ones that were initiated long ago, prior to 1905, and that's a magic date in the water law. What it means is that they're water rights that came into being before statutes were adopted. They're vested water rights. And these types of water rights are ones that there's been a tremendous amount of litigation over on the public lands. Some of the questions Commissioner Hobbs asked about have brought that up. But as it sits today, on public land, a private individual can own water rights at a spring, and those water rights they can own even though they don't own the public land. So they'll own the water rights, and the state engineer has said that. The Fish and the Forest Service is against that idea, and but for now, that's the law in Nevada. So in a lot of these areas, Happy Creek Ranch has these types of water rights at these springs, and they're these pre-statutory vested water rights that cannot be impacted by new activity. So the elk that we're talking about are not the wildlife that customarily use these water resources. So as additional populations are introduced to these water resources and they impact them, that's a concern that we want to make sure is addressed in the plan. There's a Nevada statute, NRS 533-085, that says that those types of water rights cannot be impacted by subsequent statutes. So to get to the so really, we'd like the plan to recognize that these water resources are important and that they should be addressed in the plan, and specifically that impacts to water resources can be mitigated. Just like impacts to land resources can be mitigated. So the plan does a good job of addressing how impacts to land resources can be mitigated. What we're concerned about is those water resources. So if we go to the plan, if we go to page 7, and these have come up, these ideas have come up a little bit already in the conversation, but there's a series of bullet points at the top of page 7, and it's my understanding these are the factors that are considered in amending the plan. Or in amending the management of elk in the area. We'd suggest that an additional bullet point be added to that list, which says that impacts to private land, grazing permits, or water rights, that should be one of the factors that's considered in analyzing whether an amendment is needed to the management plan. So that's one suggestion that we have. And the reason I chose that language is because we have private land, but we also have grazing permits that are not the private land. I think this was the issue that was already described. So if you included impacts to private land, grazing permits, or water rights, you would capture all of the potential property rights that could be impacted. Then in the carrying capacity section, which is the next one on page 7, we'd like it included that NDOW will consider the availability of water resources when it's determining carrying capacity. And here, this really explains how the carrying capacity was determined in this case. But if carrying capacity needs to be reanalyzed, we think that the availability of water resources should be part of that. Now, on page 25 of the plan, there is some management actions. And so we have a few requests here, and again, focusing on water resources. So on page 25, this describes the NDOW management actions. And in the first one, we'd like to add language that says that part of NDOW's assessment of the status of elk populations, which is that first sentence, NDOW will assess the status of elk populations, including population composition, production, distribution, harvest, and health data. We'd like to add in any impacts to private land and grazing permits or water resources. That will be something that is a part of the management that NDOW will take on, is to include an assessment of those impacts when it's managing the population. On page 26, there's a series of management options described for private lands and public lands. What we'd suggest is that in number 3, under that, where it says the Department of Wildlife is authorized to pay for elk damage, including losses to crops, grazing reductions, and privately maintained improvements. We'd like that to say losses to water rights, crops, grazing reductions, or privately maintained improvements, to just clarify that is also something that should be assessed and potentially mitigated if an impact occurs. Lastly, on page 33, there is this is the appendix, I believe, and there is a list of programs to prevent damage for elk, and there is a specific item number 2 that says compensate landowners or permittees for elk damage on private or public lands, and we suggest that include or to privately owned water rights. So that is that's the thrust of our comments. We just think that this would make the plan more complete, and then if there are impacts to water rights, and hopefully there aren't, hopefully the counts have been properly determined and the counts can be managed, and if they can, maybe the impacts are minimal. But if that's not the case, we'd like there to be an understanding that water resources are important and need to be addressed.
Mr. Taggart, you're up against your time, so please wrap up with your final point.
I was wondering if I had anything else to say, so that timing was perfect. Unless you have any other questions, those are my comments. Thank you.
The only question I had, it would be, have any of your comments been provided to the local planning committee or the Humboldt County Commission or anyone else locally?
The only comment, we submitted comments, and there's a long list and a couple letters, and there is a section in there talking about water resources and how they should be addressed. But we didn't provide the specific types of amendments that I just described. Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Johnston.
In full disclosure, too, I was going to bring this up. Mr. Taggart did call me about this. He had some questions for me that I didn't know the answers to as we talked through some of the issues about the water rights. I guess my question, though, is wouldn't all water right holders take the right subject to wildlife use?
Well, I think that the question comes up of when we introduce a new population to an area, then that is not customary.
I think maybe if we were transplanting animals into the area, I could see that. But if they're migrating on their own into an area and you're adopting a plan, it seems to me that what would happen, let's say you have an increase in the deer or antelope population near these areas, and the water right holder says, well, these animals are getting too significant in numbers and they're damaging my water right. I don't know. There would be management tools I'm sure we could do, but I don't think the water right holder would have the ability to force the department or the commission to do something. I mean, it seems to me if there's a senior water right holder in the state of Nevada, it's going to be the wildlife.
Well, certainly wildlife is entitled to water, and it needs water, and we understand that. But if a governmental action leads to an impact on that water resource, if NDOW takes actions and expands populations to take away those water rights, and for instance, if a water resource was completely taken up by wildlife that had been expanded in populations through management by NDOW, I think we have a question. I don't think it's as clear as that. I mean, customarily used by wildlife.
If no plan is adopted and the numbers go above what is being proposed, the department and the commission's taken no action, which you can point the finger at on the damage of the water resource. So by limiting the numbers, we're actually mitigating that issue.
Well, you may be correct. If the government did not take an action, I don't think we'd be here talking about it. But this is an in-doubt action. This is a decision to take action. I guess I don't want to get into a debate on whether or not this expands customary use of the source. I think there's the potential for that. And I think if we build in these ideas into the plan and we just keep an eye on these things, we'll avoid a conflict. I hope that's, and that's really what we're hoping for. But I do think there's some questions about what happens when we expand the wildlife populations to numbers that start to impact those water resources.
Additional questions from Mr. Taggart? Yep.
Just to clarify, Mr. Taggart, are you representing then the water right holders? And are those predominantly big ranchers?
Yes, my client is the same as Mr. Swagger. And yes, the ranchers own the water rights on their ranch areas, their private ranch areas, but also on the area of their grazing allotment. If there's springs in those areas that were used by cattle before 1905, typically they're determined to be water rights of that base ranch. And so that's been the evolution of the law there. So those private or those public areas that have springs can often have private water rights on those springs.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. One question I have is, I know certain water rights have a holding for wildlife, and if you were to pipe it from the spring source down a canyon or something, that a certain amount of water has to be left at that spring source for wildlife, so that you couldn't contain it all. Are you saying that the vested water rights has nothing in there for wildlife, that there may be a certificated right or something that come later that has the wildlife right to it? Or?
Well, it's a great question. It kind of brings up what Mr. Johnston was saying. Is the wildlife was there before all of us were there, and so there's some use. Now, when we became a state and then we created a state agency that regulates water, we gave that agency the power to issue water rights. And when he grants water rights, the state engineer, those water rights that he grants are subject to wildlife use. And so we're talking about if the state engineer grants the water right to somebody, they can use the water from that spring, but they can't pipe it and completely remove what wildlife customarily used. These pre-statutory water rights that came along before the state engineer was created, they're broader in power. And so it's a harder question. There's no clear statute that says that you're limited from customary. You're limited to allow the customary use in one of these pre-statutory rights. And I think that's where Mr. Johnson's question comes up: is, well, is the wildlife prior appropriators? I think that customary use by wildlife is a small amount of water, and so that typically doesn't become an issue. It's when we expand populations and start to create a bigger impact than that historic use, that's where they concern.
Thank you, Mr. Taggart. Additional public comment in Reno. Item number 7, this is the Humboldt County Elk Subplan. Seeing none, public comment in Elko
No comment in Elko.
and Las Vegas.
No comment, Chairman. Thank you.
Okay. All right, with that, I'll bring it back to the commission. Just a couple of things that I'd like to point out. I think in the discussions that I was privy to in the meetings that I was able to attend at the subcommittee, I think water was very clearly brought up and discussed in the conversations. The assertion that essentially there are no elk in Area 3, in my mind, is a false assertion. I have physically seen them in Area 3 personally. I think we've had documented observation through the Department of Wildlife as well in some of those areas. When you look at our policy 26, item number 7 on page 3 clearly states the commission will retain ultimate authority on the course of action to be taken following identification of successful elk colonization. And so We asked the Humboldt County Elk Subplan to develop a countywide plan for a county where elk have colonized and established. And I remain comfortable with that direction. And essentially that's where I stand at this point. It does concern me that some of the specific comments, while I think productive and collaborative, were not provided to either the local planning committee or the county commission. So, questions or comments from other members of the commission? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In thinking about how my perspective is on this plan, goes back to one time when I first came on the Wildlife Commission, and we were discussing whether to reopen an elk plan. And the discussion went back and forth for quite some time, and we were kind of bogged down. And the director at that time stood up and said, "Hey, guys, the point that I want to make is that we do not want to jam elk down anyone's throat." And the reason that stuck out in my mind at the time was that we're always going to, when we discuss elk or new plans or whether to reopen one of the old plans, that issue is going to come up. You're going to find people that want more elk, and you're going to find people that want no elk. And so I kind of get that feeling here that in passing this plan, we are going to be jamming elk down certain people's throat. Now, with that being said, we did follow the process. And looking at these different units, and if you look at the sub-plan, we went from higher numbers, the committee did, down to final proposal of lower, fairly conservative numbers. When the committee got done, there were advocates for higher numbers that weren't happy, and naturally there were people that wanted zero elk. They were not happy, and the committee was kind of somewhere in the middle, in my view. So that is why I see that while these numbers are not perfect, there's a COT team in place to address problems, not just to recommend changes in numbers. There may be problems arise as far as impacts to private land that the COT team, which is a local team, can address and bring to the commission. I certainly don't have a problem with adding the language that Mr. Taggart suggested, and he was very specific as to the places where he thought that language should be added. So I will defer that to you, Mr. Chairman, as to how you want to proceed with that.
I would make one comment on that. I do have a concern on the suggested change to page 33, where we're talking about adding water rights. That's actually an NAC, and obviously we can't change an NAC today. There's a whole separate process for that. One thing, and maybe Chairman Booth or Ed can address this, but I think going forward, one thing we could do to easily clarify some of the concerns that have been raised is on page 7 with the triggers. One of the triggers is property damage, and in parentheses we say lossing trough. I think it would be a very easy and very clear fix, and I think stay within the intent of the local plan and the discussions to add within those parentheses damage to other private property and or water rights. I think that would clarify what the committee should look at and the COT committee should look at going forward. And then I wouldn't have a major concern with adding a bullet point on the list of triggers, and that would simply be availability of water resources. I think those are things that the committee has probably already discussed to some degree. I think those are things that the committee are going to look at, whether we tell them to or not. But I think those additions actually help bolster the plan. And so, Ed or Mr. Booth, I don't know if you have concerns with those sorts of additions or not, but I'll let you answer that.
For the record, Eddie Booth.
For the record, Ed Partee.
You know, water rights were discussed at our meetings as a result of Mr. Schweigert's presentations. My recall is that as I'm not a water rights attorney, I'm not a biologist. I'm just chairman of the board and trying to get this accomplished. And so there are various factors within the whole process that, and that's why we had 15 members of the committee, because every member brought a professional and knowledgeable perspective to the committee. I thought Mr. Tiger's comments were very well presented. I appreciate the fact that he wasn't argumentative about the plan, but just trying to make it a stronger plan. My perspective personally is that I would like to get a legal perspective from NDOW, the Attorney General's office, whatever, to make sure that we are following the proper procedures there, because I'm not familiar with water rights.
So, Mr. Booth, the question I had is in regards to the triggers on page 7. When we say property damage and in parentheses we had loss of crops, do you think it's consistent with your committee's direction and going forward that we add damage to private property and or water rights in that list?
Private property, there again, water rights. I'm afraid to put something in there with the interpretation all the way through and not having the background on what those water rights really mean.
Okay, and then adding a bullet on considering availability of water going forward. Does that seem reasonable?
I think that's reasonable.
Mr. Partee, any concerns with that?
Yeah, I just have to echo what Eddie says on the water rights issue. I mean, is from the conversation that was taking place, and I'm no water rights guy either, but it's my understanding that water is primarily left at the source for wildlife. So I'm not quite sure what effect that has, you know, the water rights issue. But like I said, I'm not too familiar with water rights, and I don't pretend to be. I just listening to the conversation that took place here. So that's my only concern.
Questions or comments?
I guess I have a question, but I think it's going to be best directed to Mr. Taggart. Is it all of your clients' water rights that they have a concern, or specific ones? Because if you start reviewing the permits, I mean, you have some of the identified ranches. I see some water rights that seem to be a fairly small duty for stock watering from an underground source, and other that are stream sources. What is the concern? I mean, because, you know, when I look at a permit, I was pulling some of them up here online, and I start seeing, you know, a few hundred acre feet from a stream source for irrigation purposes. I think it's really going to be an impact for wildlife. When I see another permit for the Happy Creek Ranch, it talks about gallons per day based upon so many heads from an underground source for stock watering, and I can see a trough being out somewhere for the livestock. I can see, well, there's a concern that if you have 50 head elk coming into that trough to drink, it's going to impact that. So is it a subset of the water rights, all the water rights?
Well, the NAC talks about damage being any change to the quantity of private property. I think that's, you know, private property's water rights. And We don't. I mean, we haven't gone water right by water right through every ranch and decided which one might be impacted. I think it's fair to say though it's really the ones in the public land and the grazing allotments, and I think the plan does a good job of addressing improvements, like physical improvements if there were harm to that. I think that's addressed. So I think it's really those resources that are on the public lands and that are springs up in the mountain area.
So I guess my question is, if the plan already talks about private property and water rights or private property rights, haven't we already addressed the issue both in the administrative code and the elk management plan?
No, I don't think we have, because the NAC is clear that damage and the protection of damage can include water rights. And so it's certainly within NDOW's power to mitigate for impacts to water rights, because it can mitigate the impact to any private property. But the plan itself is focused on land resources and doesn't have that additional reference to water resources. And so that's why I went through and suggested additions to specify water rights in certain locations.
Additional questions, comments?
Ironically, the property rights really get to the issue, or speak to the issue of resources in general, right? And there's only so much to go around, and I guess that was my original concern just for the wildlife in general. But ironically, it comes by way of, as humans, having an interest in those rights. You know, if they are property rights, whether you want to say having access to a permit is a property right, but we definitely know water is something that you have a right in, and obviously the land that we already talked about. I don't think it would be incorrect to include mentioning those rights in the plan themselves. Obviously, any changes to NAC would need to go through the workshops. Jeremy, if there was going to be something like that, I know it could be argued either way what really is a right as to some of the administrative codes right now, what we're speaking to. But in general, I think what Mr. Taggart, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you're just saying to add those rights or interest in them as triggers for NDOW to look at when they are managing the elk population, is that correct?
That's one of the suggestions we had, yes. I mean, the other is on page 26, there's a specific explanation of the type of elk damage that can be included in a mitigation action, and it does not list water rights. So yes, it's in the management and determining carrying capacity. Let's remember to think about water rights, but it's also when we mitigate, let's make sure water rights are a qualifying type of damage that can be mitigated.
I think those are reasonable additions, in my opinion.
Okay. Additional discussion? I guess my thought, and I think Commissioner Johnston hit on it, the very first bullet on page 7 is property damage, and I had written down some notes to add in the parentheses. To be honest, I think property damage already includes that. Availability of water, I think, is a good one, and probably simply an oversight, but it's kind of the pleasure of the commission in terms of how we'd like to proceed here. Additional comments, discussion? Commissioner Bliss?
Yeah, I guess, just a question, I guess. Where it says, just go from on page 26, the Department of Wildlife is authorized to pay for elk damage, including loss of crops. If we add in water and or permits, what determines a loss? I mean, one bite of grass would be considered a loss. It would be something new. I mean, what? I'm sure we already do it, like for the elk damage, the tags, the landowner tags and stuff. Is that something similar that how that would be considered for the way this language is? I don't know.
I don't have a comment. Mr. Young?
Mr. Chairman, my recommendation would be to refer back to the committee and have them work with Mr. Taggart and incorporate those. I mean, it's insulting for them not to be part of that process and let them figure it out. I got every confidence in our committee members. Pete articulated very well how the process worked. And usually when a process doesn't please anybody on either side, that's probably the best process. But I do think he made some good points, and I think we ought to have our committee consider those and see if we can't maybe meet here even and get them included in there, get it over with. Just my thought.
Additional comments?
So I guess I'd go along with the lines of some of the comments have been made. I mean, if the goal of this plan was to avoid conflict between private property holders, permit holders, and water right holders, and that was the goal, and that's how they established the numbers, then it seems to me that we could work language in to address some of the concerns that have been expressed today by the private property owners, the water right holders, and that, so that if we're trying to develop a plan that minimizes conflict, it's no guarantee you're going to not have conflict, then why not try to take that effort now? And I can understand where people who hold water rights have concerns. I don't know if there'd ever be a position where someone can say, well, now there's X number of elk in an area and I'm entitled to damage. I don't know if that would ever be the case. Hopefully it'll never be the case, but I don't think it will be, but I don't see a problem in one last go around to address these additional comments. I know there's been a lot of work done by this committee, and I hate to punt it back to them, but I'd rather get it right the first time and feel completely comfortable.
Chairman Booth or Partee, any thoughts on holding another meeting?
For the record, Ed Partee. One thing I'd like to bring up that we did talk pretty extensive about water rights, and the committee did shy away from it because no one there is versed in water rights, and they didn't feel that it was the committee's responsibility to deal with water rights because it falls under a completely different area. The understanding that wildlife has access to water, no matter who the right is kind of how they felt. Maybe Mr. Booth heard it a different way, but that's the way I understand the committee felt. They didn't want to try to tackle something that they really had no control over, per se. It's out of their purview, perhaps, but I mean, if we say we're going to have another meeting, then we're going to have another meeting.
Yeah, I do know that from the very first meeting and probably every meeting beyond there, water rights always came up as a question.
And the other thing that concerns me is here we've had 9 meetings. We've been doing this since last June, and it's not until this last minute that we start getting this. I appreciate Mr. Taggart's comments, and it would have been really great if he would have shown up 4 or 5 meetings ago so that this could have been worked out, not in the 11th hour. Thank you.
Eddie Booth, for the record. I have no problems with water rights. The only problem I have is the can of worms that it may open, and that is you have, and Mr. Schweiger provided documentation that indicated all of the water rights that individual ranches had, and in part of the 2,100 pages that initially that he brought up to the board or to the Department of Wildlife as well as to our committee. And there were pages and pages of those water rights. And when you talk about damages to individual ranchers because of water rights, who's to say it's the elk that are causing the problem? Who's to say it's the drought? Who's to say it's the deer, the coyote, the wild wolf? I don't know. And there again, in our committees, I don't know if we can certainly take it back to the committee, but I think we need direction I think we need legal direction and some time to give it some thought rather than just say, I think it's a good idea. I agree. I think it's a good issue. However, what resolution are you going to find if there is a spring that goes dry? What's going to determine who's at fault? I don't know. And so that's a question that I think that as the committee, and Ed is correct, we have brought it up. We want to throw it in your lap and say what direction to go. You can give it back to us and it may come back right to you, but I think it needs to be some thought on your part. Give us some direction and we'll go from there. Or pass this plan right now, and it'd be under the direction of the COT committee.
Commissioner Holmes?
Yeah, I want to get into this issue just a little bit, because I don't think necessarily we have to revise the plan where we assume liability if resources are depleted in any way. We just need to be triggered to respond, right? Because we're going to be managing elk populations. That's what NDOW will be doing. So, for instance, if permittee holders are getting their permits tossed back at them because of lack of resources, and or there's water issues, that's the department's notified accordingly, and perhaps we manage the population accordingly. That's how I would see it. I don't really think that NDOW would go out and somehow have to be liable for every loss of property incurred. I mean, that's obviously too much liability to take on. We would just be responding to managing the elk population.
Right, and I guess that's why I'm comfortable moving the plan forward today with maybe the addition of that one bullet in terms of availability of water, because for a couple of reasons. One, you have a living document and a local team. So if an issue arises, because it's going to be impossible for us to identify all those issues today, if an issue arises, they have a local team where that issue can be brought to and resolution sought. And if there's a role for us to play in terms of how we manage the harvest strategies, then we do that. If there's other actions that need to be taken, in many cases, I think the Department of Wildlife could take those actions without it ever having to come to us. And so I guess I'm comfortable knowing this is a living, breathing document, advancing it today, because as those issues come up, it's going to cycle back from the COT team, and if there's something that indicates that we need to change the actual physical composition of the plan, we can do that. Or if it's a case where we can address it through the Department of Wildlife, we can do that. Or if it's a case where it takes specific commission action, we can do that. So the flexibility provided going forward, I guess, is where my comfort is in moving the plan forward today. But that's just my opinion.
I, on the other hand, think that from the base starting up, it would be nice to have some of those points of contention that have come up in the committee meetings brought into the document. I mean, again, not stating that we're somehow, or the NDOW somehow liable for any property loss, but that any type of indices that shows that there is loss occurring be reported back to NDOW and considered in the elk population numbers. That's all. I don't think that would be harmful to the development.
Commissioner McNinch?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I tend to agree with Chairman Drew. I think that we do need to move forward with it. With all due respect to the private property owners, historically I've been pretty supportive of where they're at when it comes to the wildlife and stuff. But the thing that concerns me is, and I'm going to go back, and again, I'm not saying this as a reflection necessarily, but it's a question in my mind. It's fair to throw it out there. Today it's water rights. Okay, it's an issue of water rights. It has been brought forward in the context it has been today. So for me, it's a function of what's brought up next. Is something else going to be brought up next? I don't know, Mr. Taggart, Mr. Swaggart's, what their, what else might pop up as part of this process as we continue to push it down the road. And I think that we need to get something in place. We have an obligation to do that. We have a requirement to do that. I think that the committee's taken it as far as they can at this point reasonably. And I think that what you've proposed with your additions on page 6 or 7, I'm sorry, I lost the page number, on 7, are reasonable, and I think it gets us moving. It is a living, breathing document. We've got folks that are coming to the table with concerns right out of the gate, and perhaps there's other concerns that we're not aware of at this point. They're going to show up, and I think it's time to move it forward. And I think it is where it's at for a reason, and I think that it's proper and right to get it into place and move forward, then modify as we move forward where we can get that information. We can ask for the expert opinions if that's what we need to do, and work it that way.
Additional comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just go ahead and speak on my position. I feel that we can move it forward with the addition of that one bullet point on page 7. I feel that the committee's done a great job. A lot of work involved, and I feel with the COD in place that there will be, if there are any problems arise, that we'll be seeing some resolution regarding those issues.
Commissioner Young.
I generally agree, but I would like to hear from Mr. Taggart. I mean, these are ranchers that are trying to deal with the bureaucratic process and committee meetings, and we got different opinions as to when it was brought to the table, but they hired some experts here that have years and years of experience in dealing with water rights issues and other things. And their water rights are extremely complicated, and the lifeblood of a ranch is not just the land, it's the water that goes with it, because we all know that it has to happen. But Mr. Taggart, do you think with the addition of what Commissioner Valentine said, that's a good start and we can move this thing forward? What's your opinion on that? And you're representing the ranchers that I think we represent as commissioners, so that's the point of my question.
Okay, can I respond?
Yep.
Mr. Chairman. Well, I think I really appreciate the suggestion of making that change. I think the other ones that I suggested are important too. It is the interest of the private ranchers. We hope to manage, if you manage a population and the numbers that we're hoping to manage them in, that's great. But if they explode all of a sudden and an impact occurs, that's what we're worried about. Hopefully that never happens. But if it does, we just want this included, because there is a process already for mitigation. It's detailed, it's through NDOW, you submit your complaint, they come out and do an investigation, and it isn't just an automatic, we're going to get for every quart of water that's trying to, that's not what we're talking about. You have to go, and we don't welcome how difficult that process is, but we understand there's a process that we have to go through. So the concern I have is just, we're not adding a lot. We made these suggestions generally at the lower meetings. I was not asked to attend those meetings, but we did have a representative there talking about these water issues. And now it looks like the plan is going to get approved, so we wanted to be real specific about how we thought our concerns could be addressed, and that's why we put them in the way we did. But I think the bullet in 7, on page 7, the inclusion in the carrying capacity, adding it on page 25, where NDOW is, it's something NDOW will assess when it's doing management, and also on page 26, where it lists what mitigation possibilities there are. We just like that to include water rights because it's not specified there. I think it's important now. You're basically telling the NDOW staff, this is what the plan is. This is what you're expected to implement. And that way, when we go to them and we are talking about issues, there's no question in their mind, yeah, water rights are one of the things that we have to keep in mind when we're managing this plan. Thank you.
Additional comments? Director Wasley.
Just a general comment. Thank you, Chairman Drew. A lot of the challenge in species management planning, and this instance with elephant management, is being able to determine what the likelihood of occurrence is. So there's a lot of speculation, a lot of what ifs, and I think an element that's missing from this discussion is what has happened elsewhere. We have 29,000 elk in the state. Have we documented where there has been a loss of that right? And with fluid dynamics and spring recharge, I don't think we're talking about cows going thirsty because of the consumption of water. I think there's a greater likelihood that those impacts would arise from wallowing activity in those spring soils. But I'm not aware of any instance where we have seen an infringement on that property right as a result of elk at much higher densities than we're talking about here in habitats equally dry. I think it's a good contingency to consider. I think some of the language that we're talking about adding and acknowledging that water right as property hopefully would cover that concern, but given the history and given where we are with 29,000 elk elsewhere in the state and the absence of that being materialized as a serious issue, hopefully provides some level of comfort.
Additional questions or comments?
Chairman Drew.
Commissioner Johnson.
Yeah, after hearing from Mr. Booth and Mr. Partee, I think I'm a little bit different frame of mind than I was earlier. If they went through the water rights issue at each meeting, it's the best they can do. And I appreciate the issue and the effort that was put on there, and this is, we addressed it, we talked about it, here it is. I'm not as inclined to send it back to the committee as we were. Page 26 of this plan says the Department of Wildlife is authorized to pay for elk damage. including losses to crops, grazing reductions, and privately maintained improvements. That doesn't mean compensation for elk damage is limited to those three things. It's an authorization to pay for elk damage. I think with the additional bullet point on page 7, we can move the plan forward after hearing from all the interested parties, and particularly Mr. Booth and Mr. Parker.
Additional comments or questions? Commissioner Moran?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The question that I have, you mentioned on page 33, I don't think we've touched on that one yet.
Yeah, and 33 was the NAC reference.
Correct. Are you saying that that language references NAC, because it's not actually in the NAC language, correct?
Actually, what I'm reading, assuming I'm looking at the right place on page 33, where it talks about elk damage payments, that's an NRS citation.
But I think if you go above that, it's where my interpretation of what we wanted it. Where it goes to the top, it says NDOT has numerous programs to prevent damage by elk. These include the following.
Okay. Yep.
And Mr. Taggart's suggestion was on number 2 of that one. Is that where you were looking? Or, yeah, where it says compensate landowners and permittees for elk damage on private or public lands or privately owned water rights.
Was that,
Sorry.
is that your suggested addition?
Yes, it was up there in that list of options, and my understanding was then you have the NAC or NRS support for each one of those options follows that. So it's that summary of options.
Okay.
That's where I was
Item 2.
So I guess my question to you, Mr. Chairman, is that's not the same place that you thought that you wanted it at?
We could make that addition, if so desired. Additional questions, comments, or discussion?
Chairman Drew, I just was going to say, I think for the most part, I'm hearing that on page 7 for the bullet points, that very first one being property damage, perhaps a quick fix and to keep the document moving forward would simply be to include the language impacts to private land, grazing rights, and water rights. Or including but not limited to, letting it, the department know that there is a broad array of issues to be assessed, and letting the ranching community know that we understand that those issues exist. And I'm going to say David McMinch, but with mentioning, I believe this is a working document. It will change over time, but going in, I think it would help with the clarity there and alleviate some of the animus in that area, and it's a fairly easy fix to make.
Additional questions or comments? Commissioner Johnson?
I'm going to make one final comment. There's one other additional reason why I think this plan is, I'm not as concerned about some of the concerns, is when you look at the numbers that were developed for what the habitat can support versus the numbers of the management levels, it's very conservative. We have 034 and 035 at 0, and 051, 100 to 200. On the Sheldon 0 to 400, and 031 and 032, 0 to 100 in each of those respective units. And when you compare that to what the committee identified as what the habitat could support, they're conservative numbers. I think that's reflective of the action the committee took in consideration of private property, water rights, grazing permits, and that. So I just want to make that statement so I can let everyone know, understand that's really a big part of my consideration as well.
Okay. Additional thoughts or comments? Mr. Morai?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Okay, if we go to page 25, where were we gonna, the suggestion that was made, if we followed that, where would that language be added in?
The suggestion I had made?
On number 3 on page 25, under population management, is that?
Right, that was my suggestion. Sub 3 at the bottom of the page, after the first sentence, adding a sentence that states, when a population reaches 75% of the population objective, the department shall work with the commission to implement harvest strategies that limit or stop population growth before the population objective is reached or exceeded.
Okay, I think Mr. Taggart had something, some more language pertinent to impacts to private land grazing water rights on page 25 also.
Right. Because impacts to private lands, grazing rights, or water resources.
Where at on page 25?
I believe under sub 1, but is that correct?
Right, it's the end of the first paragraph, first sentence in sub 1.
Could you read that for me, Mr. Taylor, just so I got make sure I got it?
Yeah, so sub 1 says, NDOW will assess the status of elk populations, including population composition, production, distribution, harvest, and health data, and I suggested you put a comma, and impacts to private land grazing permits and water resources.
And I guess my thought on that is essentially what the COT is being set up for. So my comfort rests in having it better defined under the triggers, but that's just my personal druthers. Okay, additional comments or questions? Discussion?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just say one thing, when you put all those things in a list, I consider all of them property damage. So, in my mind, just by adding the additional bullet on page 7, I think we're going to cover all the property issues regarding damage, whether it's water rights or crops or whatever.
I agree with Commissioner Valentine. I think it's a very easy fix. We spell it out. I think we alleviate a lot of the animus, like I said. We just call it out for what it is. If we all agree that that's property damage, why don't we just say it?
Okay. Additional comments or questions? Commissioner Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess my question on that is what do you see would be the negative effect of adding it to these other pages also?
I can tell you one of my concerns is I don't know that we want to put NDOW in the position of determining whether or not a permit has been damaged. I mean, if you look at sub 1, basically what they're talking about is their normal survey, population modeling, and everything else. I think what the concern is damage, potential damage to those items going forward, and I think the COT is better equipped than why it was set up is to address if conflicts start arising, that it's a collaborative process rather than having the department independently.
This is not saying that they're having to determine that, correct?
And that will
it's saying they will have to assess that
and assess the impacts.
Whoever determines that in the end would be the managing agency. Isn't that correct? When if it gets to the point where you have where loss has to be determined.
I think in some cases they do that anyway with the list of private land programs that we have. But in my mind, I would rather go broader with the whole COT because NDOW is included on the COT. So a concern could be raised by NDOW, a concern could be raised by a permittee, a concern could be raised by a county commissioner, so on and so forth, federal agency. I think the fix or the addition that Commissioner Hubs has suggested, in my mind, addresses it.
think so. Thank you, Chairman Drew. I think if we were to add that, I mean, look, all we're saying is these are triggers that can adjust, in which NDOT would respond to adjusting population numbers, period.
Correct. Additional discussion? Answer your question, Commissioner Moran?
Yes.
Okay. If not, is someone willing to take a stab at the motion? Or is this going to go to the middle of the table? I'll attempt it.
All these lawyers around.
With that, I'll make a motion. I would make a motion to approve the Humboldt County Elk Subplan as presented to us by the committee and endorsed by the Humboldt County Commission with the following changes, and these are all additions. On page 7, that the first trigger read property damage, including but not limited to crops, land, grazing, and water rights. Then an additional bullet be added that would read availability of water resources. Then on page 25, under NDOW population management, item 3, right immediately after the first sentence, we would add language that reads, when a population reaches 75% of the population objective, the department shall work with the commission to implement harvest strategies that limit or stop population growth before the population objective is reached or exceeded. No further changes to that paragraph.
Mr. Chairman, I'll second the motion.
Okay, I've got a motion and a second by Commissioner Valentine. Is everybody clear on the motion, and are there any questions? Okay, any discussion on the motion? Commissioner Morai?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess, well, I would have liked to have seen that language added in that, on those other pages. I do get your point on the addition of that language on those other pages, so I think I'm going to support the motion.
Okay. Further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries unanimously, 9-0. With that, I would like to just again reiterate my appreciation of all the staff who's here today, as well as the staff back in Winnemucca. Chairman Booth, you and your committee, I know you guys will be working diligently going forward. So I appreciate everyone's efforts. I appreciate the diligence of this commission and the people who showed up today to present their thoughts and ideas.
For the record, Ed Partee, Mr. Chairman, one other question. Are you going to do a separate motion for the appointment of the COT or included in this motion?
Chairman Drew, I almost stopped you, but I didn't. I wanted to know if we should have them take place in separate motions, but if it's all included, I mean, that's up to you, I guess. If we should, maybe to make sure that we are in agreement to the COT members themselves, can we do another motion? Or do we have to discuss separating the motions?
Understood. Let's take a break, and I will not close item 7. Let's take a 15-minute break because it's been a long road to hoe, and I'm going to figure this out on the proper procedure going forward.